for the drums.
Hey, Jonathan,
Hey, Keith.
what you got today?
Well, we're going to continue on our journey into Tableau's totals. And so last video, we did a piece on total versus window functions, the table calculations, because totals work more like Tableau's built-in totals. Window functions work like the total using feature, which we're going to talk about today in more detail. And the part I wanted to go through is kind of a baseline, since we talked about kind of the aggregation piece, is now what are the things we can do out of the box in Tableau? What are those core features of Tableau's totals capabilities?
Okay.
And then what we'll do beyond this is we'll talk about some of the limits of them and where we start wanting to get into doing all the ways that we can want to customize grand totals.
Got it. Okay. So
Yep.
second video in the series.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was totals versus window sum, window average, table calcs. This
Yep.
one is what do we just get out of the box? And then
Yep.
from there, you're going to take us down the rabbit hole of when out of the box doesn't satisfy, what can we do?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and I did for people who think you know totals or things, like we did a trial run of this earlier with Robert, and there were a couple things he hadn't seen before. So hopefully, even if you think you know Tableau, there'll be some new stuff in here for you.
Yeah, there's some magic.
All right. Yeah. So let's get started. So today we're going to talk about a few things. So one is totals and subtotals, what we can do for those. Another one is total labels and location. So where we're putting totals on the screen and how we're using them. Total versus total using, as far as what those results are and how it changes aggregations. And then where we start looking at where those boundaries are of what totals can do, where we start running into some of the limits of them,
Okay.
of what we want to do. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Tableau. And here I've got a really basic data set. We've got a few different dimensions in it: color, region, size. We have color here and size as dimensions, and then we're summing up our value across all of those. And we do have nothing in purple right now.
Got it.
There's just no data there. So for column grand totals, and this is one of those places where terminology can be weird, because columns in Tableau are things that create multiple columns, but the column grand total, when we add that, is adding a row that is the sum of all of the columns in this case. So there's our column grand totals. And oh, I love demo workbooks. So you might notice the total came out on top here
Yeah, it's at the top.
instead of the bottom. So that is one of the things when we're using totals. I'll be diving into this a little more later. Is in the analysis menu with totals, we can have totals by default are showing up on the bottom. In some earlier version of this workbook, I had them on the top, and so that's why they showed up on the top. Yay, demos. So our totals here are totaling up to sum of values. So 14 plus 14 is 28, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. Just the pill that's on the columns makes a new column,
Mm-hmm.
but the column grand total sums down the rows.
Or down the rows for that column.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's just one of those things. It took me a while to just get that in my head of when do I want a row grand total, column grand total. So for row grand totals, so those are going across the row. And here, before I had used the analytics pane to drag out totals, here I'll use the analysis menu and go to totals, and then I can show row grand totals. And now we have 14 plus 12 plus 10 is 36.
Yep.
40 plus 31 is 71, and so on. So those are our row grand totals. And a way I think of totals, like a row grand total, is that the grand total is if we're totaling up the data, ignoring our um, our dimension on columns.
Yeah. Or if there's multiple dimensions on columns, it's just going to ignore all of them.
Ignore all of them. So for example, if I drag out region here and I put it on columns, so I'm now breaking down size by region, that grand total is still 36. It's
Yep.
ignoring these dimensions on columns to get its results. Um,
That's the way that Joe Mako had taught me to think about grand totals, is just pretend it was its own worksheet,
mm-hmm,
completely separate worksheet that is ignoring the thing that's on the counter position of the rows or columns. So the row grand
yes.
total would just be another
Mm-hmm,
worksheet just like this one, but
mm-hmm,
ignoring whatever were the dimensions on the columns.
yes. Yep. Yeah, and we're actually going to go into some more details with that because there's some edge case behavior with relationships. So that'll be
Yeah.
a later video that we'll do. Um, a lot of the time, these just work the way we expect. Then we have subtotals that we can also do. So for subtotals, here I have color, region, and size as my dimensions, and I'll just use the analysis pane. And when I turn on subtotals, Tableau by default is going to add all the subtotals. So we don't have a subtotal for size because that doesn't make sense to total up large, total up medium, but we do have a subtotal for region where we're going to total up all the sizes for that region and so on and so on. So if we right click on the fields, there's no subtotal option on size because that's the rightmost field.
It's the deepest granular thing that's on the rows, and so it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
make sense to total that thing.
Yep. And then on region, we have subtotals as an option. And then in color, we have subtotals as an option here.
So that's already huge for me because I had always just assumed, because I never dug deeper, when you turn on all subtotals that you just got them all and there was nothing you could
Mm-hmm.
do about it.
Yep.
But it turns out if you have multiple dimensions, you could just decide which ones you want subtotals and which ones you don't by
Mm-hmm.
turning them off.
Yep. And if
Okay.
we rearrange the view, then our subtotals are going to change. So if I put size in the middle, now I don't have, because size didn't have subtotals turned on, it doesn't have subtotals now, but then I can turn on subtotals for size
Mm-hmm.
at this point. And if I rearrange fields, like I put color and size up here, then I can have subtotals for color, but not for size, because that's the rightmost or deepest field in this little hierarchy we've created on columns. And then region doesn't have subtotals as an option.
Because it's the deepest.
It's the deepest. Now, the thing that we can do at this point is I'll just use the analytics pane and totals. I can add column grand totals here. So now I have column grand totals and some subtotals. And then if I want to, I can go to row grand totals as well and turn those on. So we can have lots of subtotals, grand totals, all in the same view. This is one of those cases where this is a little wide and we might want to have
That's where you would maybe put the total to the left.
to the left. Exactly. Then we can do that analysis menu, totals, row totals to the left.
Yep. The only thing that you can't do with this, I appreciate you showing me that you can turn the subtotals on and off for anything that isn't the deepest,
Mm-hmm.
but I can't label those subtotals with an independent name for the region that it is or for the
We
dimension
can
member that it is.
do a little bit of customization on it. So let's go to my next bit here where I've got subtotals on for my total labels.
Mhm.
So I can right click on the total and choose format.
Yeah, and you can shade it a different color.
I can shade it a different color. I can change my font and so on. So maybe sorry, that's the header.
Yeah.
But for the totals, we can make it big and bold, for example. But we can also change this label. So I can do this like size subtotal.
Yeah.
So this is a hard-coded entering this in here on this. And then if I do something, I'll just go to the analysis menu and let's add like row grand totals. I can also format my row grand total. So this is like my region total here.
Yeah. So that's cool. You can kind of tailor the label, but the subtotals for the size, they're all going to get the one label that you
Mm-hmm.
have. And I
Yep.
can't say that this is my blue subtotal and my orange
Mm-hmm.
subtotal and my purple subtotal.
Yep. This is one of those places where we need to go to one of the custom totals methods,
Okay.
which we'll be talking about in a future video.
Oh, nice. So you're going to teach me how to do that. Cool.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So we can change total labels, we can format them, and this is a handy feature to be able to do to play with that formatting. Now let's talk about the aggregations, which we've done a little bit of in our last video. So here I have value and a value copy, and I have two of them here, and I've just dragged it out with a default aggregation. And there's times when we want that grand total to be an aggregation of an aggregation. So instead of the sum of all of these values, I might want the average of all of these values, for example. And Tableau introduced what was called the two-pass totals features. But this is with total using. When we're doing automatic, we're doing Tableau's default aggregation. That is like a total table calculation. But then I can change this and say, I really want this to be something else like average, min, maximum, or even hide the grand total because that might not make sense for my data. So here, if I do average, then 52 is the average of 36 plus 49 plus 71 divided by 3.
So what you're saying is I could hide the total for just the value copy, but keep the total for the value?
Yep. Or I could hide this one and do that one
Yeah,
as the
and keep
average.
just that one, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
value copy here is the average of those things
Mm-hmm.
because you've done the two pass totals or the total all using average,
Yes.
which is going to behave like a window average table calculation. It's going to average
Mm-hmm.
the marks on the screen.
Yep.
And then for the value one, you've just said that I don't want any total at all, hide it.
Mm-hmm. So that's one way we can use this. Now, where this starts getting particularly interesting is when we start having other aggregations. So here I have the measures average value, and we've got different results for each of our colors. And then if I change my total using here, so this automatic total using is that total table calculation. So this 12 is the average across all of the data that's showing up here. And if I do total using average, now my average is the average of these three marks.
Right. And that was our earlier conversation, the
Mm-hmm.
first episode in this series in the playlist, where we went deep into how those two things differ.
Yep.
Okay.
So in that way, this total using is a useful feature. And then we can do the same thing with count distincts as well, for example. So here we have total using, and then I could do a total using sum, for example, to do the sum of these count distincts instead of that count distinct across all of the data where we only have the small, medium, and large sizes.
Yeah, I think this is a really common use case where you might want to sum up the count distinct of things, as opposed to that 3 is just how many distinct values are in the underlying data set. That might not be a very sensible number to show.
Yeah. So one of the ways I think of total, because in English at least, total and sum are often um, synonyms for one another.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to Tableau, I think of total as we're going to run this calculation over the totality of the data.
Yeah.
So it might be a sum, or it might be a count distinct, or it might be an average.
Mm-hmm.
And then what the two-pass totals are doing is saying, okay, we don't want to run it over the totality of the data with the automatic, where we want to do.
We just want to take those aggregate
And
marks that are on the screen and average them or sum them or count them.
you got it.
Yep. But notice how there isn't a window count or a window count distinct in that total all using.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of interesting.
Yep. Yeah, it's doing the Tableau provided a few options here.
But you don't have like the window correlation, which you could get with the window table
Exactly.
calc. You don't have a two-pass correlation total here.
So there's some basic functions here. So one of the ways people start wanting to do custom totals that we'll be talking about is maybe I want my custom total to be the sum of the top 10, for example. Or maybe I want my total to be some other calculation entirely, like not using this at all, but it's instead a percentage of something. So lots of different ways that might go, and this is where we start getting into writing calculations and customizing grand totals.
So those would be the reasons to subscribe to this playlist and keep watching.
Yep. Yes. And then the other place where this runs into, and now this is all the basic built-in total functionality in Tableau. And now we're going to talk about some limits to this. So here in this view, I've taken my data set and I have a kind of a no-op table calculation here. In my second column, I have a field from a data blend. So we're seeing the little orange icon here. We've got the little orange blend icon here where I'm summing up a measure from my secondary source as my third measure. And then I have a blended calculation that I've written that's using...
where the blend is baked into the calculation itself.
Yeah, I'm using fields from multiple data sources in the same calculation. So that's what I mean by a blended calculation.
What is that second column, the one that says table calc, no total using? What's that?
Okay. So here is just a table calculation.
Okay.
On the data. It could be any table calculation.
Okay.
And the reason why I pulled this up, and it's, if you're reading the names of the calculations, you'll see it. When I right click on these fields, we see the total using. But if I change this to average, or I change my total using to minimum or maximum, nothing happens. So even though Tableau is showing me this here, it's not doing anything. The only thing I can do is hide if I want.
And the rest of them act like they did something, but nothing happens.
But nothing happens. So Tableau doesn't support total using for table calculations.
Which kind of makes sense because the total using is dropping into a window sum, window average table calc. You can't really do that on top of another table calc. It would get really messy.
Well, you can nest table calculations.
That's true.
And this is actually somebody just pointed this out to me today, and we'll link to the feature request. It is the 9th most voted feature request for Tableau at this time.
Wow, to be able to do that total all using on a table calc.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a way, like, for me, when I look at this, I can see 3 numbers and I can add them up.
Why can't you, Tableau?
Why can't you? Yep, you can do it here. Why can't you do it here? Like, it's
right. And it's true. I could wrap any old table calc in a window sum. Why not? I got it. Okay.
Yep. Then we also have, so in this case, we have this regular aggregate measure coming from a secondary data source. So it's a field we're using straight out of our secondary data source.
It's just an aggregate. Yeah.
Just an aggregate. And when I do total using and I say, let's do average, average works.
Okay.
here. So it works in this case, doesn't work in this case. But then if that secondary calculation is a blended calculation, so if we look at the formula of this,
where the blend is actually in the calculation editor, the blended
yep,
field is not just pulled over across the data blend as a raw field from the other data source, but it's actually like from the secondary data source inside of the calculation editor.
Yep. So we have a field from our primary, we're looking at color, and then here's our field from our secondary. We're doing this. When I do that total using, and let's say I want to do average here,
Wow.
I get a red pill. And then it says the calculation is invalid. So we get these different, so in this case, when I tried that total using, it didn't do anything. In this case, I tried to do the total using.
And it turned red.
And it turned red and it breaks. So Tableau doesn't support these situations. And these are situations, again, where we may need to go to custom grand totals.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, the differing behavior. Total all using on an aggregate from a secondary data source, no problem. Total all using on a table calculation looks like it should work, but it didn't do anything.
Yep.
Total all using on a calculation with a secondary data source in the calculation editor field, it turns red and just breaks.
Yeah. So at the deeper level, what's going on in Tableau here is within, like we talk about Tableau's order of operations, and you've got a video on that coming up. And in that, there's these extra subtle, we talk about like table calculations and aggregates and row level calcs and things like that. There's some other subtleties in Tableau's order of operations that most of the time don't show up, but here's an edge case where they do. So with that, just to kind of review where we've been at and coming out of here. So built in, we've got column, row, and subtotals in Tableau. We can customize our total labels, but it's customizing that label for all instances of that label. So if we want individual total labels, that's a place where we'll go to doing our own calculations. What we talked about in the prior video, those automatic totals are doing the aggregation at that higher level where they're ignoring the dimensions in the view. And then the total using or true pass totals are doing that aggregation of an aggregation. So we can do a sum of an average. We can do an average of a sum. We can do a sum of a count distinct and so on. And then total using, like we were just talking about, is not supported for table calculations or blended calculations. This is where we'll dive into this in future episodes.
Got it. Super helpful.
Yeah.
The clouds are parting.
Yeah. Hopefully totals are gonna, because you'd mentioned before that totals are one of those things
Oh my God. I just like avoid la la la. Don't talk to me about those things. I don't understand them. I don't want to know.
Yep.
But now that you lay it out like this, it's not too bad. I get it.
Yep. And they are one of those things I will turn on at times in the course of, like I may have sort of the directive to build the bar chart or the map or whatever, but I'll have a view and throw totals on just because those aggregations at higher levels can be really useful for me in analyzing the data, and then I'm turning them off as I'm getting to the view. So hopefully this is helping them be more useful for you and everybody in our audience.
Yeah, totally. Well, I can't wait. It sounds like we've got 7 or 8 more of these episodes to go. So you've got a long guided tour through the rabbit hole of this stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next.
All right, great. Thanks.
Okay. See you soon.
All right, take care. Bye.
Action Analytics.